All right, it is Monday, so we checked our course outline. Today we're finishing up assignment 1, turning it in, having a presentation critique. But before the presentation critique, we're actually going to discuss question of the day 1, which is also part of this unit, unit 4, that we're finishing up. And then once we're done with that, we're going to get introduced to unit 5 and our fantasy creature. So we have some supporting reading, if that's helpful to you. This is other ways to acquire raster-based information. So about scanning and how you can use that for making composites as well. We even saw some professional examples, using kind of scanned and photographed leaves to make birds out of. And it's just other kind of raster things. But this is supportive of what we're doing, not required. The chapter that is required is the one that's going to support our next question of the day, which is chapter 2. And you can see that linked to the January 27th reading. And it is all about digital image mining and understanding the image rights that go into it, right? So important reading for you there. All right, now let's get to our project. So this is what we did last week. We came up with a fantasy theme. We found digital image reference that was high enough resolution, at least 1,000 pixels in both dimensions. We saw some professional examples. We used our sketch based on our theme and the reference we found to start rough cutting out a collage of at least 5 different layers. We're trying to create 3 layers of depth. And now we're at this step, which is starting to use direct adjustments. And there are 3 direct adjustments we learned for this class. This is on raster imaging and controlling the color and the lighting of your pixels. Those 3 can all be found under image and adjustments. They're called direct image adjustments because they physically change the pixels within the thing you've selected or the layer that you're on. So we saw with what we did last, I took my background and we started to play with the sky and then the mountains in front of the sky and then the mountains in front of those mountains. So right now I'm on this layer and I made that match with this layer with that layer in terms of color and lighting. So now we need to move in front of it so that as we start to blend, before we start erasing or cutting things out, we already have lighting and color doing what they can to match. And this is within Photoshop. The process is the exact same in Photop, the browser-based freeware that we can use to practice. All right. So before I cut out certain things from this, I want to play with its direct adjustments. And the first direct adjustment is levels. So you go to image adjustment and you'll see these top 4, all of these have to do with lightness and darkness. It's about value, not color. And the one that I find most helpful is levels. Most professionals I use skip right to curves, but curves has color attributes as well. It also has gamma attributes. It's a little dangerous unless you understand printing technology. And since we don't know that, the more user-friendly, easier to comprehend one is levels. So levels gives you a histogram for every pixel in the layer. So I have this layer selected. It's got a lot of middle ground images or pixels in it. You see it doesn't have any super dark pixels, even though it looks like it does. And I can tell that from the histogram. And that's because I'm on the wrong layer. So let me make sure I select the right layer, which is this one. Yes, that's the one I want to do. So notice it's not this mountain. It's only the one with the bridge. So if I go to image adjustment, once I've selected the right layer, I go to levels, I can see I have some really dark pixels, but if I wanted to make those darker, I could push that shadow slider to the right. The problem is that turns everything behind it to solid black pixels. And if you make them solid black pixels, it's called burning. It means you lose all pixel definition. You can't get them back. So you don't want to mess with that slider to begin with. Same thing on this side. I have very few, but a few bright white pixels. And I can blast those out, right? I can push that so that every pixel behind the white slider, or to the right of the white slider, is solid white, which might make it easy to select and delete, but the problem is it gets rid of all that pixel variation in the lights. So when we do levels, for the interest of making things match and compositing, we don't play with the shadow slider or the highlight slider. We play with the midtones. We always start with midtones. Midtones is where you can push it to the left, you can push it to the right, and you can see what matches better with what you already have. And I'm just going to push mine a little bit to the left. You don't want to go more than 50%, or you're going to start losing a lot of that pixel variation. So usually the most I want to do is about 20-25% from the middle. All right, and then I hit OK. There's other things I can do. If I knew I wanted to make this just brighter, I could limit how dark it could go. Or I could limit, if I wanted to make it darker, like it's a night scene, I could limit how bright the range of brights go. I'll tell you, this is the one that's usually more useful in limiting the brights. But for this, I want a lot of kind of open light, so I'm not going to limit that. Now, every time you do a direct adjustment, it does change your pixels. So how can you tell if you really want it or not? You can go in your history and just click before it and then after it, and you'll see the difference it made. So that was it before. It looked a little dark, a little too intense. For these mountains, I still want this to be in middle ground, kind of coming towards us. So I want to save my real high contrast for the foreground, for that the tree and the rocks. All right, next, that's lights and darks. I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Color Balance. Now this is my favorite tool. It is the color temperature, the overall temperature of the pixels. Black and white are not colors. Thus, perfect grays mixed with black and white, like 50% gray, which we use for our background, is not a color. Colors are wave spectrums that our eye reads on our visible spectrum, from infrared to ultraviolet. So this allows me to push that spectrum towards the warm colors or towards the cool colors. And just like with levels, we want to start with the midtones. So if I start with midtones here and I kind of see the whole thing, trying to balance it with the kind of purplish haze I have going on, I first decide, do I want to push it overall, the midtones, more towards yellow or more towards blue? And I just want to push them slightly towards blue. Do I want to push them more towards magenta or more towards green? I want to push them just slightly towards magenta, if anything at all. So barely at all. Then do I want to push them more towards cyan or more towards red? It looks like just a tiny bit towards cyan. Then I could go to highlights. Now you could just skip it there as you're getting used to it, because the midtones does a lot of it for you. But if you want to be fancier, especially as we get closer and closer to the foreground, you want to give color variation in warms and cools to your highlights and shadows. And in general, typical color theory, warms come forward, so you give it to your highlights. So I'm going to go to my highlights, and I'm going to push that a little bit towards yellow, just a smidge, and a little bit towards red. And that helps it come forward a little bit. Then in my shadows, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to push them a little bit towards blue and a little bit towards cyan. And then we can see if we like that. So this is without any color balance. You can see all the greens, the yellows that are in there. And then after the color balance, it's matching a little bit with the color temperature. Even the sky blue, which I wasn't looking at, is matching the sky blue. All right, now move to the next direct adjustment I want you to use. So we've used levels, you use color balance. You always start them in this order because it will make the biggest difference. And then if you need it, you go to hue saturation. Hue saturation is for big color changes, not shifting all the temperature towards one side of the spectrum, but actually changing the spectrum color. And you can do that under this hue slider where you see infrared on one side, ultraviolet on the other. I can push it all towards the infrared, or all towards the ultraviolet rather, all towards the infrared, and they look kind of psychedelic, but you lose a lot of color variation that way, right? So really, the only way you use hue when we're trying to match things is you just push it a little bit in each direction and you see which one makes sense. And I'm just going to push it a tiny bit that way. And then the other big help for color is how intense it is. If color is a wave that we recognize based on the frequency of the wave, like that's red versus green, the intensity of the color, like how fluorescent it is, right? How strong it is, that's the amplitude of the wave. So we can adjust that without losing the color. That is called saturation in art, the intensity of the color. If I really up that, it blasts everything to its maximum saturation, and it shows me how much magenta and purple is actually in that image now. And if you take it all out, then it becomes grayscale, right? So you can decide how much intensity do I want. And usually as things come forward, they get a little bit more saturated, right? The background's very washed out in the atmosphere, but it's going to get just a tiny bit more saturated as it comes forward. So I'll put it right there. And then the lightness slider, I don't want you to use at all in this tool because that's better served through levels, right? This is basically the an overall brighten or darken. And it's a clunky tool compared to the mid-tone slider in levels that helps us control that. All right, so let's see. This was before. This is my bridge layer. This was after levels. I brightened it. This was after color balance. I pushed it more towards the cools and the magentas. And then this is the color saturation. And I just kind of dialed it all in. Now, when I go to that layer and I start to blend it, I don't need to get perfect selections anymore. I can do things like magic wand with contiguous and grab that edge, and then I can just erase away with a large low opacity eraser. And because the colors are already matching, I can clean it up and it will look very believable as we pull away. And then same thing with these clouds. Now that the colors match, I can reveal the mountains behind them in the mist. I can use my magic wand. I can select all of this. As long as I don't accidentally erase my mountain, my magic wand selection of the clouds is going to mask it, so I can start revealing that background behind. And if I add to it, it's a little bit of a pain with the bridge. But if I add to it all of these little spots, I don't want to accidentally erase the dark parts of the bridge. I'll erase those people eventually, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But this is all with Magic Wand Contiguous at the default tolerance of 32. I'm holding down Shift to add to my selections. I'll turn off the layer so you can see all that selection, right? So now when I erase on the bridge layer, you have to have it turned on to erase from it, you'll see that it will leave the bridge but show everything else. And now I am just blending with my soft-edged eraser. And you can see that one little thing I didn't select, which was around the whites there. But I'll get that later. So masking and erasing.